I thought it was just curiosity, the way I watched her move, the way her voice lingered in my mind. But the night she smiled, she looked like someone who had lived through a dozen endings and learned to sit peacefully in the aftermath. I told myself it was just curiosity. That's what it always starts as, right? You see someone who carries a certain kind of calm you've never known, and you want to understand it. When I finally spoke to her, it was accidental. She dropped her pen, it rolled toward me, and I picked it up. Just an exchange of small words, polite smiles. But her eyes held steady on mine, warm and assessing, as if she were silently deciding whether to let me in or not. "You're a writer?" she asked, noticing the open notebook beside my coffee. Her voice was low, textured, like a melody played too close to the heart. "Trying to be," I said, smiling. "Then you should know. Stories often begin with things we pretend not to feel." Her words lingered longer than they should have. I didn't know whether to laugh or look away. She smiled then, not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that quietly shifts the air around you. That was the first moment I felt it. That strange, unspoken gravity that pulls two people together before either understands why. After she left, I caught her reflection in the glass, the faintest curve of her lips, as if she knew I was still watching. And that was all it took. Curiosity began to turn into something else, something slower, deeper, and far more dangerous. As I walked home that evening, the city noise faded into background static. I could still hear her voice, replaying that single line in my head. Stories often begin with things we pretend not to feel. That night, I wrote it down in my notebook, not as a line of fiction, but as a warning to myself. Because even then, some quiet part of me already knew this wasn't just curiosity. It was the start of something that would change everything I thought I understood about longing, restraint, and connection. The days after that first encounter were strangely vivid. Every detail of her lingered. The tilt of her head as she read, the slow exhale she made when coffee was just the right temperature, the faint scent of jasmine that clung to her hair. I told myself it was just memory playing tricks, but deep down, I knew curiosity had already started to stretch into something more intimate. Our paths crossed again in the same cafe, by chance or perhaps some quiet inevitability. This time, she acknowledged me with a nod that held a hint of invitation. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, an unassuming gesture that shifted the space between us almost imperceptibly. I felt the thrum of something I hadn't anticipated, a nervous awareness of her presence, an acute sensitivity to every subtle movement she made. We exchanged casual words, but the pauses carried weight. Each glance, each shift of posture, seemed loaded with meaning I couldn't yet define. She leaned slightly forward, resting her hand on the edge of the table, and I noticed the gentle curve of her fingers, how they caught the light. Her eyes met mine for longer than necessary, warm, steady, as if silently asking me to notice more than the obvious. "You write often?" she asked, voice soft, measured, almost teasing. "I try," I admitted, "though I'm not sure it's ever enough." She smiled, small, knowing that a gesture that made my chest tighten. "Perhaps it's not about enough. Perhaps it's about noticing what others overlook." Her words, like everything she said, carried layers I felt without fully understanding. She was patient, quiet, yet precise, every motion, every glance deliberate. And in those moments, I realized she had a way of drawing attention not just to herself, but to the space between us, to the unspoken tension that was slowly gathering. At one point, our hands brushed as she reached for her cup. The contact was fleeting, electric in its subtlety, enough to make me aware of the pulse in my veins. I tried to act natural, but inside, I was painfully aware of her nearness. She noticed, of course, there was that faint smile again, knowing, almost mischievous. I left the cafe that day, feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. There was an invisible thread stretching between us now, delicate but undeniable. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. Every lingering look, every careful word, every brush of skin hinted at something far deeper. That evening, I found myself replaying her gestures in my mind, The slow way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle way she rested her chin in her hand when she was thinking. I realized something. She was inviting me beneath the surface, into a space where curiosity became something more, a quiet, compelling pull toward connection, understanding, and perhaps desire. I wrote in my notebook again, carefully, almost reverently. She smiles, but it's more than a smile. It's a question, a challenge, and an invitation all at once. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine not just noticing her, but being seen by her, the first step in a slow, unspoken journey that neither of us could yet name. By the third week, our encounters had shifted from coincidence to something that felt quietly inevitable. I began noticing her in moments before she even entered the room. The soft swish of her coat, the faint scent of her perfume trailing in the air, the calm rhythm of her footsteps. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was awareness, a delicate tension that made my chest tighten without warning. That afternoon, the cafe was nearly empty, sunlight pooling across the wooden tables. She sat across from me, the space between us charged but comfortable. We spoke in small, unhurried sentences, yet every word seemed to carry weight, like each one was carefully measured to draw the other in without rushing. At one point, as I reached for my notebook, my hand brushed hers. It was accidental, fleeting, barely enough to register as touch, yet it sent a shock through me that lingered longer than the contact itself. I felt her fingers tense briefly, then relax, as if she had anticipated it all along. She didn't look away. Instead, she held my gaze with quiet amusement, a subtle invitation to acknowledge the electricity between us without breaking it. "You're always writing something, aren't you?" she asked, voice soft, teasing, yet curious. "Trying to," I replied, aware of how close our hands still were, though we weren't intentionally holding. "But maybe I just need inspiration." She tilted her head, a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Perhaps inspiration finds you when you least expect it, and in the people you never imagine." Her words hung in the air, sweetly elusive, leaving my mind spinning with possibilities. There was a quiet bravery in the way she existed near me, without forcing anything, a confidence that contrasted sharply with the rest of my restless uncertainty. I realized that being near her meant I was learning to slow down, to notice subtle shifts in tone, posture, and breath. Each glance, each smile, each pause felt like a conversation of its own. When she leaned slightly forward to reach for her cup, our arms touched again. This time longer. Warmth spread across my skin, a gentle reassurance that I wasn't imagining the pull I felt. She didn't withdraw. Instead, she let the contact linger, as if testing the boundaries of familiarity without breaking them. It was a simple, nonverbal acknowledgement of connection, a delicate promise that more could exist here if we allowed it. As she left that day, she paused by the door and looked back. Her eyes held something unspoken, amusement, curiosity, perhaps the faintest spark of desire. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just attraction or fleeting curiosity. It was a slow, careful weaving of emotional intimacy, each subtle touch and lingering glance binding us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking home, I replayed every detail, her laugh, the gentle brush of our hands, the rhythm of her voice. The tension wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding, a quiet gravity that made me want to see her again, to learn more, to inch closer without hurrying the inevitable. That night, I wrote once more. The first brush of connection is always the most dangerous, because it makes you wonder if you've already fallen before you even realize it. The weeks of quiet proximity had changed something in me, an awareness not just of her, but of myself. I realized that the moments we shared, brief as they often were, had started to unravel the neat layers of caution I had built around my heart. And it seemed she had felt it too. That afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual, the air warm with the golden light of late afternoon. She was already seated when I arrived, a book in her hands. Yet her eyes lifted and found me, as though she had been expecting me. We exchanged our usual small talk, but beneath it, something unspoken simmered, a tension that demanded acknowledgement. Finally, she set her book aside and leaned back, observing me with that same calm, knowing gaze that had first drawn me in. "You seem distracted," she said softly, almost like a question rather than an observation. I laughed nervously, hiding the flutter in my chest. "Maybe I'm just thinking too much." She smiled, a slow, careful curve of her lips, and tilted her head slightly, inviting me to speak. "Or maybe you're finally noticing things you didn't want to admit before." Her words were gentle but precise, and I felt the fragile walls I had built around my emotions begin to tremble. I realized then that she wasn't merely observing me. She was guiding me into a space where I could be honest without fear or judgment. I exhaled slowly, and for the first time, I allowed myself to speak freely. "I've been thinking about you a lot," I admitted, my voice quiet but steady. "More than I probably should. I tell myself it's curiosity, but it's something else. Something I can't name yet." She reached across the table then, her hand hovering near mine, the faintest brush against my fingers enough to send a shiver of warmth up my arm. "You don't have to name it," she whispered. "Sometimes feeling is enough. Sometimes acknowledging it is the first step." Her touch was light, deliberate, and profoundly grounding. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her hand, and the quiet steadiness of her presence. In that single, lingering moment, words became unnecessary. The silence spoke volumes. We sat together, hands almost touching, hearts subtly racing, and I realized the depth of the tension that had been building between us. It wasn't a fleeting spark or superficial attraction. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding of trust, curiosity, and mutual longing. She had opened a door to something intimate and unspoken, and I had stepped through it willingly. When she finally withdrew her hand, it was with a gentle smile, a quiet acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The air between us had changed, heavier with possibility, lighter with relief, and infinitely more tender. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, careful not to overthink. The first honest conversation doesn't just reveal feelings. It opens the door to a shared world you weren't sure you were ready to enter. And yet, you realize you've been waiting for it all along. After that vulnerable conversation, everything between us shifted, though quietly. The tension no longer demanded verbal acknowledgement. It existed in the spaces between words, in glances that lingered a heartbeat too long, in the shared silence that felt comforting rather than awkward. That Saturday, I ran into her at a small, local bookstore, the kind with narrow aisles and the faint scent of old paper and coffee. She was tucked in a corner by the poetry section, scanning a book with a soft, thoughtful smile. I paused, not wanting to startle her, but she looked up and grinned, the kind of smile that makes the air feel warmer. "You always find the quiet corners, don't you?" I said, approaching cautiously. She tilted her head, amused. "The quiet corners find me. And sometimes the people who wander into them do, too." We walked together through the aisles, talking softly, yet much of the communication happened in subtle ways. The brush of our arms when reaching for the same book, the way our shoulders occasionally touched, a shared laugh over a title that seemed absurdly long. Each minor gesture felt like a secret, a quiet intimacy that didn't need a name. At one point, I picked up a book she had been eyeing and held it out to her. Our fingers brushed, light and electric, sending warmth through my arm. She accepted it with a small, teasing smile, her thumb briefly resting against mine. The touch was fleeting, yet it carried a pulse, a rhythm that mirrored the subtle rise in my heartbeat. We stopped near a window, sunlight streaming over her hair, giving it a soft glow. She leaned slightly toward me, resting her hand on the edge of the display table, her gaze meeting mine for a moment that felt suspended in time. In that pause, I became acutely aware of her presence, her warmth, her scent, the soft cadence of her voice, and the way my thoughts had begun to orbit her in quiet gravity. "You make even mundane places feel different," I said quietly, almost as if confessing something I couldn't fully define. She laughed softly, a melodic, gentle sound, and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "And you notice it too," she replied. "That's the dangerous part." I felt a shiver run through me, the faint thrill of tension lingering in the space between us. It was not a sudden, consuming desire, but a patient, deliberate pull, a slow burn that grew stronger with each subtle touch, each shared glance, each quiet laugh. The emotional intimacy was deepening, layering over the physical awareness, creating a rhythm neither of us wanted to break. As we parted that day, she reached out briefly, pressing her hand lightly against mine in a gesture that was almost a promise. The warmth stayed with me long after she walked away, and I realized that the story between us was no longer only in words or shared moments. It was in these small, imperceptible gestures that bound us together. That night, I wrote in my notebook. It's in the spaces between words that hearts speak the loudest. The brush of a hand, the shared glance. These moments are where something quietly, impossibly real begins. The weeks of subtle closeness had built a rhythm between us, a quiet understanding that grew stronger with every shared smile, every accidental touch, every unspoken look. But with that rhythm came a tension I couldn't ignore, a quiet ache that whispered of feelings too deep to remain hidden. That afternoon, the cafe felt warmer than usual, sunlight stretching across the floor like golden threads. She was already seated when I arrived, her posture relaxed, yet somehow deliberate, as if she had sensed the weight of what was about to happen. We talked about books, about life, small and ordinary topics, yet beneath the surface, every word carried the gravity of our unspoken connection. I could feel it in the way she shifted slightly closer when the chair squeaked beneath her, in the way her eyes searched mine when she paused mid-sentence, as if weighing something she wasn't ready to say. "There's something in the way you look at the world," she said softly, voice just above a whisper. "Like you notice everything, even the things that no one else sees." Her words, gentle and observant, struck me with a mix of warmth and vulnerability. I realized I wanted to be seen in that way, completely without pretense. And in that moment, the pull between us, subtle until now, became undeniable. I leaned slightly closer, careful to keep the movement casual, yet aware of the faint brush of her hand against mine as she reached for her coffee. The touch lingered just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt the quiet hum of awareness settle deep inside me. I wanted to speak, to confess what had been growing for weeks, but hesitation held me back. I feared disrupting the delicate balance we had nurtured. "I can't stop thinking about us," I finally admitted, my voice low, almost trembling. "About the way you make me feel, and how different it all is." She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the faintest tremor of emotion in her eyes, a mix of recognition, longing, and caution. Slowly, she reached across the table, her hand brushing against mine again, firmer this time, as if testing whether I could hold the weight of her presence. "I've been feeling it too," she confessed softly. "More than I thought I would, or should. But it's real, isn't it?" Her words were a spark in the quiet, a validation of everything we had been dancing around. I felt a swell of emotion, relief, desire, and a tinge of fear. We sat there, fingers nearly intertwined, the world outside the cafe fading away, leaving only the warmth between us, fragile yet undeniable. That afternoon was not marked by grand gestures or declarations. It was quieter, more intimate, a shared acknowledgement of something impossible to ignore. The tension, the longing, and the careful restraint coexisted in perfect harmony, creating a moment both exhilarating and terrifying. Walking home later, I could still feel her hand, the warmth, the silent confession that had passed between us. It was the peak of our slow burn, the moment where desire and caution met, and I knew that everything from here on would be measured by the depth of that honesty. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Some confessions aren't loud or dramatic. They exist in the quiet brush of fingers, in steady gazes, in moments when hearts speak and the world holds its breath. After that afternoon of quiet confessions, the world felt subtly changed. Our interactions carried a newfound weight, a softness and openness that neither of us had dared to allow before. But there was no urgency, no rush to define what had already begun. Instead, there was a tender rhythm, an unspoken agreement to savor the slow unfolding of connection. We met again at the cafe on a rainy morning, the city outside muted by the soft patter of water against the windows. Steam curled from our cups, blending with the warmth of the room, as if the space itself had conspired to create a cocoon around us. She arrived first, as always, and I watched her settle into her chair, the light catching the subtle highlights in her hair, the curve of her shoulders as she leaned slightly forward over her book. Even the quiet sound of her breathing seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. "You're early," I said, smiling softly as I slid into the seat opposite her. She looked up, her eyes warm, and returned my smile with one of those subtle, knowing expressions that made the world pause. "I wanted to see you," she replied simply, and the weight of her words lingered between us like sunlight in a shadowed room. The morning passed in gentle conversation, stories, observations, shared laughter, yet everything was underscored by the intimacy we had nurtured. There were no grand gestures or declarations, only the quiet acknowledgement of closeness. The way our hands rested near each other on the table, occasionally brushing. The way our eyes met and held each other for a fraction longer than necessary. The way our voices softened unconsciously when speaking to one another. At one point, she reached across the table, her hand covering mine in a gesture so simple yet so profoundly grounding that I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I held her hand lightly, savoring the steady pulse beneath her skin, the quiet reassurance that this connection was mutual, real, and enduring. I never thought curiosity could lead to something like this, I admitted, my voice low, filled with wonder. She smiled, her thumb brushing gently against mine. "It's never just curiosity," she said, her tone tender, almost conspiratorial. "It's about noticing, about letting yourself feel, and about trusting someone enough to stay close." There was a pause, comfortable and deliberate, where we simply existed together, the world outside irrelevant. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The air was warm with the scent of coffee and books, and for a moment, nothing else mattered but the quiet steadiness of our hearts in sync. As the morning faded into afternoon, we lingered, reluctant to leave the cocoon we had created. And when we finally stepped outside, the rain had softened to a mist, the city glistening in the gentle light. She walked beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched occasionally, our hands brushing naturally, the intimacy of weeks past now fully realized. That night, I wrote in my notebook, some stories don't need fireworks to be unforgettable. They live in the quiet moments, the touch of a hand, the steadiness of a gaze, the patience of hearts learning to belong to each other. And in that quiet understanding, I knew we had arrived at something real, tender, and lasting. The perfect culmination of a slow-burn journey, built on curiosity, vulnerability, and the subtle, unspoken rhythm of two hearts learning to move together.